Hi, welcome to another webinar from the Florida School Counseling Association. Today we have Grace Carricarte, and she will be talking to us about youth suicide prevention and mental health awareness.
Hi, yes, I'm so happy to be here with you all today. First of all, I must thank Ms. Baritza Kostovsky for arranging all of this. This has been several months in the making. Of course, the Florida School Counseling Association for making these types of informational webinars available, especially since we know how life-saving and life-enhancing these can be. And of course, third and definitely last, but definitely not least, I would like to thank each and every one of you for joining us on this very important topic. I commend your judgment and taking your time to just gain a little bit of the basics. And it's really about going back to basics when it comes to supporting our youth mental health and, of course, wanting to prevent any fatalities that we can. So my background, just so you all know, is I'm a licensed psychotherapist. My specialty is in early childhood trauma, and I've been working in the South Florida community in the nonprofit sector with individual and group counseling. And what really galvanized me was the opportunity to engage in prevention education. Oftentimes, I found that individuals reached my office and I wish they hadn't suffered too long. And I knew that sometimes by the time they got there, that there would be a lot more work that we'd have to do to undo it. And so what galvanized me was really the importance of prevention education. And therein lies my current position as the executive director of the Ganley Foundation. Unfortunately, the Ganley Foundation, just like so many in the field of prevention, it did arise out of tragedy when Jimmy Ganley died by suicide due to undiagnosed depression. And of course, therein began their mission to really educate communities about the importance of mental health information and awareness, and really knowing those next steps to get help. And I know I'm going to be speaking to the choir when I'm talking to other school counselors. I think it's incredible the work that you all do. But in addition to that, I know that you all wear a lot of different hats. I know that those who are listening to this webinar include mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, daughters, sons, friends, family members. And I know that I hope that what you can gain out of this not only helps you in a professional capacity, but all of us being humans and hopefully minding our mental health, that it will also help you in a personal capacity as well. Like I say, we're all in this together. And I'm sure that when you all signed up to be school counselors, you thought it was your dream job. You'd be walking on sunshine every day, helping the youth of our world and making such a big difference. And unfortunately, we know sometimes we feel a little bit more like this. We have all these hats that we're supposed to wear. We have pressures from administration to fulfill multiple tasks and roles, and sometimes they don't always make sense. And yet we show up to work and we care anyways. I like this quote because it defines how I feel at times, which is I like to take life one day at a time, but sometimes several days attack me at once. Now you can see I like the use of humor, especially because we deal with very serious issues all day. And when I saw this comic, I had to add it. At first I thought it was about bullying in a child, but then when I read the caption, I laughed, I chuckled. It says, "I know the kids don't like you and pick on you, but you have to go to school. You're the teacher." And of course, we know things can be really difficult when it comes to dealing with some of those demands. And we care so much. And oftentimes we have so many students that we're trying to meet the needs of. And unfortunately, we want to make sure that those that are sensitive cases, we don't want them to ever go under the radar. But I would be remiss to not talk about your mental health when I'm about to address the mental health of those that you're trying to support. So let's not forget that 43% of all adults suffer from stress-related illnesses. It's a webinar, so I cannot ask for a show of hands. But you see there's impaired immunity, there's digestive issues, hair loss, diabetes, hyperthyroidism, obesity, anxiety, tooth, gum decay, high blood pressure, and last but definitely not least is depression. And I always tell people you can't give what you don't have, and I just beg each and every one of you to take care of your mental health as you try to protect that of those that you serve. So when it comes to depression, which was that last stress-related illness that individuals suffer from, we know so much about it. We know that it's a diagnosable psychological illness, like many others. We know that at least 90% of those who died by suicide did experience this form of mental illness at that time, and most likely it was depression, or it ran concurrently with depression. We know the best way, of course, to prevent suicide is that early recognition and treatment. And that's one of those things that has often puzzled me, is that in our society, we tend to separate physical and mental health when I really believe they need to be looked at as one and the same. It's one whole person in front of you. But I understand that historically we've kind of extrapolated the brain from the body and looked at it differently because it was such a mystery to us for so long. And indeed it still is. But that being said, there is so much that we know about our brains and its health that we don't always apply. And unfortunately, sometimes we stigmatize it. And where one person might know with, and I oftentimes use cancer as an example, when it comes to cancer, you want to prevent it when possible. You want to intervene as early as possible. And you don't want to wait until something's terminal. And I love that we're getting that message across with so many biological illnesses. And I would love for us to do more of that when it comes to our mental health illnesses, as opposed to, of course, waiting until something's terminal. And in the case of what we're going to be speaking on today, we're referring to a suicide. And of course, unfortunately, we know that suicide does remain a leading cause of death. Sadly, and it pains me when I read these statistics about our children. We know that when we come to children as young as the ages of 10 to 14, it's the third leading cause of death. And for those children and youth ages 15 years of age to 35, it's the second. So when I'm talking about it being the second and third leading cause of death, it really jostles me when I look at an average of all age groups. It's actually the ninth leading cause of death. So what we'll discuss and explore a little bit is, why does it go from being the ninth leading cause of death throughout our nation for all age groups, and yet there's these vulnerabilities in our youth that makes it go from the ninth to being the second and third leading cause of death. And what we do know is that in all 50 states, suicide does remain, our rates consistently are double that of our homicide rates. There's approximately 30 suicide attempts for every death by suicide. And for youth ages 10 to 14, that rate, very sadly, has doubled in the past 20 years. Some people say it's better recording. Some people say it's a myriad of different issues. All I know is that this is something that we can no longer turn a blind eye to. And fortunately, others are paying attention to this. We see in the Center for Disease Control came up with a new report. And what's impressive to me, to show how far behind mental health can sometimes be, especially with our youth, is that this is only the first report of its kind. This mental health surveillance report that they did. And of course, we tend to receive reports after the fact. So this was done in 2011. It was released earlier last year. And it compiled information for US children ages 3 to 17. And it came up with a lot of statistics that were very similar to what the World Health Organization came up with. And it was essentially that 20% of the world's children and adolescents do have a mental disorder or problem, and half of which, and we know the vulnerabilities of adolescents, but yes, half of which begin before the age of 14. And their overlining conclusion became that, the ideal time to diagnose is definitely in the school years. And of course, I'm speaking to you all as amazing school counselors that you are, and I guess that's where you all come in. And I know we deal with crises and putting out fires every day, but hopefully some of the information we go over will help you feel a little bit more prepared. And of course, the joke is that everything that can go wrong will go wrong at the end of the day, and usually on a Friday, right? So the World Health Organization came up that globally, similar to what the CDC found, there are some top 4 disorders: attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, behavioral and conduct disorders, anxiety, and depression, which we'll be speaking a bit more on. The second thing they came up with, which is not surprising, is that mental health disorders are a leading cause of disability worldwide. And about 800,000 people die by suicide every year. Now, of course, we're looking at this globally, so I might assume that this could be higher, especially if third world countries with less accurate reporting systems. What they found in looking at this globally, and again, we know these numbers are underestimated, they even concluded that suicide is the second leading cause of death in 12 to 17-year-olds. The fourth fact they came up with, and sadly, this is something we see far too often in the news, is how war and disasters have a large impact on mental health and psychosocial well-being. The rates of mental health disorders definitely tend to double after emergencies. And I put media down there, and I put a question mark after it, because I definitely look at the role of media, especially in covering very sensitive topics like suicide. And should they inadvertently glamorize it or increase the stigma around it? Unfortunately, it can lead to a contagion effect or people's hesitance to really move forward and get that help that they so deserve. The fifth fact that they came up with is that mental health disorders are definitely an important risk factor for other diseases, including unintentional and intentional injury. We also know that this also increases the risk of being ill from other diseases such as HIV, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and vice versa. The last fact they came up with, as they concluded, was that unfortunately, despite the existence of effective treatments, that stigma and discrimination unfortunately prevents people from seeking help. And we believe that maybe 1 out of 4 who are aware of their condition might seek any help whatsoever. And that's scary because you all are school counselors. So if you were to just imagine for a moment, what does your average classroom of 30 students look like? Well, what that looks like statistically, as far as US stats, is that 17 to 20% have seriously considered suicide by the time they reach high school graduation. So again, we're looking at it starting in the middle school years, even late elementary school years, and then progressing through high school. And by the time they graduate, 17 to 20% will have considered suicide. 13.6% actually went so far as to make an actual plan of how they would do so. And 8%, just over half of that, actually attempted to take their own life. And the scariest part for me is that only a third obtain any help whatsoever. Most of them tell no one. And if they do tell someone, they tell their peers, who unfortunately are very ill-equipped to handle it, and they tend to try to handle it in their peer group and not engage adults. And that's part of our work at the Ganley Foundation, is we really try to educate all those layers of protection. We try to educate the students, we try to educate the staff members working with them, the parents, and the community at large. And of course, try to get this into the administrative regulations so that this is something that is a must-do for every school year. So we want to be more smart about what we want to look for, because obviously these numbers are very impressive and quite daunting. So we want to look at those signs of depression in youth. Most of these are similar to what we would see in adults, so I won't read every single one. But I will go down to the last one of irritability that I put an asterisk to, because that is one of those varied symptoms that tends to appear in youth a bit more than adults. That irritability, by that I might mean outbursts, emotional outbursts, or it might just be that they're annoyed by everything. Everything seems to irritate them, and nothing that occurs, how should I put it, even the smallest of things that occur, they have a disproportionate reaction to emotionally and psychologically. So we want to look out for that. Of course, you've got the typical other symptoms we would see in adults, a lack of interest or enjoyment in things that they used to enjoy. We could see oversensitivity, a lack of interest or enjoyment, as I mentioned before. And sometimes we even see, especially in younger children, those somatic symptoms and complaints where they might say, my head hurts or my stomach hurts, where no, it hurts. And then that lack of emotional regulation where, again, they're not able to handle the day-to-day things that they might have otherwise been able to deal with. And of course, I had to add this quote, as I mentioned, I believe in the importance of humor, because this is tricky, right? Especially for those of you who might be parents of teenagers. How do you tell the difference between typical teen behavior and something that might be more serious that we'd want to be alerted towards? So I added this quote, which, and again, for you parents of teenagers, it says, when your children are teenagers, it's important to have a dog so that someone in the house is happy to see you. So what do we want to ask? Because it is tricky to tell that difference. We want to ask a few key questions, really. Is what are they normally like? Is that youth, have they had experienced changes in their performance or their participation in attendance? I oftentimes mention a client of mine who lived for soccer. He had signed soccer balls from every professional he could get his hands on. He was just all about it. And when he changed in his participation, and for him it was he no longer tried out for that soccer team that year, that definitely caught my attention. And later on I found out that he didn't want to let the team down because he didn't feel he could keep up. And he had very active thoughts of suicide. And of course for youth, we know their peer group is so important. So we want to ask also, are they no longer with their peer group, or is there a form of social rejection? Maybe they have limited friends that are available to them. A big one, a very big one, is of course abnormal withdrawal from others. I always mention that human beings as social animals, there's nothing more important than the value that we derive from our interpersonal and social relationships. So when people pull away, not only can they dig a very dark hole where they can get stuck in some of their irrational or depressive thoughts, but they don't really get that peer support or family support that is so important for their well-being. So we would look at that, or of course, if there was any unusual conflict with family or other people. Sometimes there's a lack of motivation, or perhaps a recent failure, neglected appearance, or responsibilities. But I guess why I bolded it was the most important question that I like to look at is, are these reports or observations out of character for this particular individual? And sadly, I've attended funerals of individuals who have died by suicide, and that's when, all too late, the pieces of the puzzle seem to come together. And they go, yes, I saw this. Oh, really? And then you saw that. Wow. And then I noticed he did this. And then it kind of makes sense in a choppy way. But we want to put those pieces together, of course, as early as we can. So we want to ask these questions. I tell people, put on your little investigative hat, act like a detective. Extra support and caring for somebody has never done any harm. Now, speaking of harm, when it comes to self-harm, this is something I get so many questions about. One of the big things that I've seen from staff members, and maybe these are staff members similar to those you've experienced in some of your schools, is one of the big things I've heard is they tell me, yeah, but we know they just do it for attention. It was like the cool thing to do, and they do it for attention. And so we know that they're just emo, they're engaged in drama. We're not going to really, note it. And I tell everyone, oh, please, no matter what, it's always a red flag. It's a very maladaptive coping skill. Is it for attention? From my experience, most actually tend to hide it. They don't tend to post about their cutting. They tend to keep it hidden. You know that those students with the long sleeves, even on a hot South Florida day, they'll still be in those long sleeves. I mean, is it a form of expression? Well, some of the clients I've worked with said that it became a physical sign of their pain. It was a way for them to externalize and to look at it. And sometimes when they felt numb, because oftentimes individuals, when they're in such a psychological state of depression, they say it's better to feel pain than to feel nothing at all. It actually makes them feel they're a little bit alive. And then could it be a form of escape, of slight obsessive compulsive behavior? It's possible. We do know that pain-killing neurotransmitters and chemicals are released from the brain to try to act as painkillers. And so some have said that there's an addictive quality to that. No matter what, it's definitely a maladaptive coping skill. Is it necessarily indicative of suicidality? I'm not sure, but we can't overlook it. It's definitely indicative, perhaps not of exact suicidality, but it's definitely indicative that they're heading on a path that is very unhealthy with their mental health, and it is a red flag every time. So I always tell people, never overlook it. Really always pay attention to it. A lot of kids go through things, and there's a lot of trends, but most kids don't decide to just cut themselves. And then I refer to this anonymous quote that I really appreciate, which says that everyone is fighting a battle you know nothing about. Our students come to school every day, and who knows what household they came from? Who knows if their parents are getting divorced? Who knows if there's abuse or neglect, other issues that might be running their family? There could be issues with alcoholism. There could be domestic violence. Our kids show up and they don't advertise what's going on with them. And so I definitely look at things, and whenever I see symptoms or quote unquote red flag things going on with students, I just tell myself, there's a reason for that. Short of them having a psychotic breakdown, there's a reason. It's coming from somewhere. So how can we, again, be a little detective and just really try to see where that's coming from and try to be a conduit to help them get on a better trajectory? We know things are going on with the teenage brain that are different, and I think this explains why the rates for suicide go up for this delicate youth population compared to the averages of all ages. I put that first part under the teenage brain of, what were you thinking? And I laugh because oftentimes youth, and I call it the dumbing effect, the more adolescents you put together, and research has shown this, the more they lean into social pressures, and the more impulsive they may act So they actually may not have been thinking, because also we recall they have a very immature prefrontal cortex. Their brain is reconfiguring itself. It's a huge growth spurt. Actually, we see that the brain definitely continues to grow up until the age of 25. And then we compound that with the burst of hormones as they're going through adolescence. And what happens with that is we see a youth in front of us with a very mature body. They're ready for reproduction, but yet the mind is more mature than the actual physical body. And sometimes that means that adults have higher expectations than what is developmentally appropriate for that youth. If we look at other vulnerabilities, we could look at things like the stress diathesis model, so that an individual is predisposed genetically towards certain things, and then stressors in the environment may tend to bring those about so that they manifest. Then also I look at their youth navigating their sense of identity and self and their sense of power. You know, they're trying to figure out who they are and how do they fit within their peer groups. And then when I mention sense of power, one thing I oftentimes see is that inadvertently we can disempower youth. And I'm not saying that they should have, you know, the run of the town, but how can we give them, you know, thoughtful options so that they can make decisions for themselves? Children have to ask permission when they're at school to go to the bathroom. They have to ask their parents for money. Can I go here? Can I go there? Do I do this? Do I do that? And so one thing that I think can definitely affect kids is if they inadvertently feel disempowered at a time when, of course, you know, an adult's influence is very important, again, in keeping them safe, emotionally and physically. I feel that that's the number one priority for adults to do. We mentioned the changes in the brain. There's also tunnel vision, and part of that tunnel vision comes from a lack of life experience. So for youth, and I recall this vividly from my middle school and high school days, if something went wrong, it really felt like it was the end of the world. And adults might chuckle at me at that time, but to me it was a very serious thing, because imagine I may have been over a decade old, and to me it was a significant setback, at least in my mind, emotionally. And so I oftentimes tell adults, you know, remember what it was like to be there, and, you know, let's not mock a child if they feel like something's bigger than we think it is. We may think they're being dramatic, but for them it's very, very real and poignant. Again, it's the beginning of most mood and anxiety disorders. I put pressures with 3 exclamation marks, because I don't know that I would want to go back to middle school myself. I had a hard enough time the first go at it, and I would have a really tricky time. And I imagine a lot of youth have a tricky time, and that this is a contributing factor, because then I look at the advent of technology and some of those parameters that children have to face that I didn't have to deal with, and many of us didn't have to deal with. But if we were to look at that for a moment, we know there's pros and cons to technology. And we can't negate that this is a very big role in the life of our youth. The pros, of course, you know, we're more interconnected than ever. There's access to information, we're able to learn. I joke, you know, obviously every time a child's on the computer nowadays, it's not simply for homework. This 4th one I added because my sister said, once they're on their iPads or iPhones or MacBooks or the computer or watching TV, it's a quiet house. And sometimes I just want a little bit of peace and quiet. To which I laugh, because I think to myself, when my house was quiet, my mom knew we were up to trouble. So that's part of it. It's a different day and age, as I've mentioned. We know there's practical and social communication skills that kids are able to build, just a whole new level of technical competence that most adults can't compete with. When my iPhone breaks, or I'm stuck with a question about technology, I tend to look for the youngest person in the room to help me out. And of course, we have heard of some of the cons when it comes to technology. There can be contact with predators or bullies. We've seen bullies play a big role in sometimes, unfortunately, egging on a child who's vulnerable and reaching out online, and sometimes egging them on to do so, to take their own life. We know there's access to harmful information, and that some of the entertainment can be age inappropriate. Of course, this makes children less physically active. Some have mirrored the brain of a child using technology to that of an addict, because they're stimulated, pleasure reward centers tend to be triggered. And sadly, kids can really build their own secret world when they're online. And I put parental supervision as my last bullet with a question mark, in so much that I personally consider computers to be a deadly weapon. Many people wouldn't actually look at it that way, but when I think of those funerals that I've attended of children who have died by suicide, typically within a year or so prior to their death, they were already on sites, on websites, looking up how to die. They were looking at other suicide stories. They might have had somewhat of a death obsession. And by the time the parents crack their password and get on and see what websites or what chat rooms or social media things that they were engaged with, the parents are shocked as they try to find answers, unfortunately. And we do say when somebody dies by suicide that most of the answers die with them, but we do get to put some pieces of the puzzle together, and oftentimes we find some of those pieces on their computer. So I always tell parents, you know, kids will be smarter than us technologically 99% of the time. But if there's 1% that you can have over their heads, please know how to look at their search engine history. Please know how to monitor it. If you want to know what's going on with your child, see what they're curious about. See what they're researching. We want to always make sure that we do our best to enter their world and know what they're curious about, so that we can ultimately do what I've expressed before, which is to always keep them safe. And speaking of parents, I put this slide here with the word commit with a question mark as a reminder to myself, because one of my first weeks when I was working at the Ganley Foundation, and I was so excited. And of course, what do we say in our society? We say that people committed suicide and that's how they died. They commit suicide. And I was working, and I promised this mom that I would always share this very teachable lesson for me, and to pass on that lesson with others, is that I was at a gathering and somebody pointed out that a mother in the room had lost her son to suicide, and if I had any resources for her, that they thought she would definitely appreciate it. So I walked over to the mom and I let her know that we had certain support groups for parents whose children had committed suicide. And she snapped right back at me and said, "My son did what? He did what?" And I thought, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. I thought that you, and she goes, "No, yep, that's me. My son did die, but he died by suicide. He didn't commit suicide." And therein lied my lesson to really be sensitive to some of the survivors. We have over 30 million individuals who have lost loved ones in the United States to suicide. And they tend to be very sensitive about their terminology, and they prefer die by suicide. And I understood, as the mom explained to me, the difference between the connotation of that word. And she said, you know, let's look at the denotation and the connotation. But what does commit actually imply? It implies that, you know, that you actively chose to do something wrong. Because what do we commit in our society? We commit sins, we commit crimes, we commit adultery. We actively engage with a healthy mindfulness to do something bad. And she said, has anybody that you know ever committed cancer? Or have they committed a car accident? And I got her point, and I definitely took it to heart. And she gave me a great big hug after that lesson and said, now I know you won't do it again, but just pass on the story and help other people be more mindful. And I realized why we had to be more mindful. I went home and I looked up the terminology. And unfortunately, to show how our lack of progress within our field with this, or within the fields in general, is that the term commit suicide came from a time in the Middle Ages when we incarcerated the mentally ill with the murderers, with the thieves, and it was an actual crime against the law. And so that's why I try to be as sensitive as I can to others. And if I hear it, it doesn't bother me, but I definitely think it's noteworthy that people don't commit suicide in the exact sense that it's used. People actually die by suicide. Which leads me to this next quote, which says that people who die by suicide don't want to end their lives. They want to end their pain. And that's something that clients have relayed to me over and over. They wanted to live, they wanted to be happy, but they felt that they had used every resource that they knew of that was available to them, and the pain was so overwhelming. And of course, we know this is emotional pain, but let's look at this in a PET scan of activity in the brain when it comes to the neurobiology of depression. What we know is that pain is physically very real. In this image, we see a PET scan of activity in the brain, and that on the left is that of a depressed brain, and that on the right is that of a not depressed brain. Wow, as we look at those images, can't we see such a huge difference? And that brain's ability to function, to get up every day, to engage in its daily activities and succeed in daily responsibilities. Of course, if we were to imagine a student showing up at school with a depressed brain, that's that image on the left, we can understand their inability to concentrate. We can understand their inability to emotionally regulate or to function as well as other youth might. So of course we see, just like if we were looking at an x-ray of a broken, what we see in this image is that depression and mental illness is very, very real. But we don't walk around with a PET scan, do we? We walk around, doing our best to understand things that are going on that are not seen. So how do we have to be smarter? What do we have to know regarding risk factors, for example, so that we can be smarter at really moving forward and intervening and finding our youth help as soon as possible? We should know that one of the biggest risk factors is a prior attempt. Youth who have attempted suicide previously are much more likely to turn to that in the future, especially if there's a distressing life event or a triggering event that might upset them. Of course, an existing history of psychiatric disorder, stress, of course, a family history. We are very aware of the genetic component to mental illness, just like any physical illness. Of course, impulsive youth are more likely to act on any suicidal urge that they might have. We're familiar with the role of neurotransmitters, such as a decrease of serotonin in the brains of individuals who are depressed. When it comes to contagion, we see that exposure to suicides that are not handled properly can unfortunately increase the risk of suicidality in those youth who are exposed to it. Of course, if there's ineffective coping skills or access to lethal means, we have to look at these as very serious risk factors that we cannot overlook. Sadly, when it comes to access to lethal means, 20% of at-risk individuals have access to a gun in their home. Parents typically think that children don't know. Children are so smart, they're so curious, and they tend to know. And even if we think we have the gun safe or everything set up, and I'm not advocating for or against guns, but obviously if there is a youth that is suicidal, we need to remove every lethal means possible within their home. And you heard me mention the computer, but there are websites, sadly, that will tell kids how to take their life. We'll look at household products that might be available to them, what type of pill concoction to use. You can take a quiz to see the best way to end your life. So I look at that, and I definitely, of course, we want to protect our kids. And we know there are vulnerable populations out there. We know that females, for example, tend to report depression 3 times more often than males. Now, the key word for me in that bullet is the word report. Do males suffer as often as females? I'm not sure, but I know that these are self-report measures that have stated that females are more likely to experience depression, but we can't negate that the statistics show us that males are 4 to 5 times still more likely to die by suicide. And that goes back to that slide on the means of which individuals tend to end their life. And this is part of why we think males are more, and I hate to use the word effective, but their deaths tend to be achieved when they're aiming to end their lives, because they tend to use more lethal means, such as firearms. They tie a very strong noose, and females, in general, tend to use pills. And so when we look at this, so why does that increase the death rate for males? Well, what we know is that the amount of time for somebody to intervene between a bullet to the head and it resulting in the end of life is minimal. We're talking milliseconds. Males also, when we go back to that word of report, they're probably less likely to share their plans than females are. And when they use more lethal means, of course, their rates will be higher. Now, females being able to, oftentimes engaging in the use of pills or other less lethal means, oftentimes they're more likely to share their ideas of taking their life or their plans, which allows for intervention. But pills could take, hours. I had a client once who's told me, "Well, I just thought I would fall asleep and wake up in heaven, and that would be the end of my pain." Instead, she almost died by gagging on her vomit in bed. It was a very violent several hours for her until somebody walked in, which allowed for her successful intervention and for her to be taken to get the right medical assistance that she needed. Um, so, when it comes to males or females, I don't want to overlook either population, of course. Both are at high risk. And then, of course, those exposed to violence and abuse are a vulnerable population, as well as those that are in trouble, especially transitioning students. I'm adjunct faculty at the University of Miami, and what we see is sometimes study abroad students or students who have just transferred in. They don't have the same support system that they used to have. So that can be a tough time when you're navigating youth issues as well as trying to navigate your day-to-day life and social affairs with that lack of support. Of course, we cannot overlook the learning disabled whatsoever. They can be a very challenged population, as well as the GLTBQ, the gay, lesbian, transgender, bisexual, and questioning population. We add the Q because sometimes kids are they're questioning, they're trying to figure it out. And what we do know is that there is nothing inherent in the DNA of a member of the GLTBQ population that would predispose them towards having a higher vulnerability towards a mental health disorder or suicide. What we do know is that oftentimes it's the manner in which society treats them that elevates their risk for suicidality. And not only do other people put pressures on themselves, and what we've seen is that parental approval is actually really key with this population. That's one of the most important things for being a protective factor for their mental health during this vulnerable time of their youth. But we also see, in addition to that, it's sometimes the pressure and judgment that they also can place on themselves at the same time. Two populations of vulnerable youth that we used to overlook, and I'm so grateful that we're really paying more attention to them, are those overachievers and perfectionists. These I call pressure cookers. These are the youth that want to be perfect. They want to please everyone. They want to do great. They want to be a shining star. But as most of us know, good luck being perfect. It is a very imperfect world, and it's very tricky trying to navigate that. And sometimes these are the kids that we inadvertently reinforce the pressure they put on themselves and add to it. And sadly, the last two suicides that I attended the funerals of, I would say they fell into this population of overachievers and perfectionists, or as I call it, that group that is the last person I would think, oftentimes people would say, out of all the students, I would have never thought him. This one, that one, the other one, but this one, he was the last, or she was the last person we would have ever thought. They were the star. But we know they are also a vulnerable population. Of course, we know, and I love that we've gotten a lot of awareness out there about bullying, but anyone subject to that, harassment, loners, or neglected youth, we definitely want to be aware of and provide as much protection for as possible. And you heard me mention earlier about, how we look at mental and physical health different, but we obviously have to join forces. And it's more important than ever if we look at the facts. 80% of youth who died by suicide actually saw a medical professional within at least 6 months of their death. So hopefully we can get some of those who work in the medical profession a little bit more in par with some of that information that we're trying to disseminate to all of you in our counseling and psychology profession. Another study actually found that nearly half of all suicide victims had even seen their primary doctor within a month of killing themselves. And so I look at this quote from Robin Williams, and I wonder how many people, maybe they don't speak up to their doctors, or they don't have the words, or they don't really understand what's going on. I know that Robin Williams died by suicide, and of course he had another diagnosis of Lewy body dementia, which the World Health Report also said oftentimes, mental illnesses are concurrent. But this quote caught my attention because I wonder how many kids feel this way. He said, I used to think the worst thing in life is to end up all alone. It's not. The worst thing in life is to end up with people who make you feel all alone. And if you think of that image of the brain and what that brain is able to process when they're in a state of depression, they're not able to feel what is oftentimes so real, which is that of the love around them, that of the options that are available to them. Oftentimes they get stuck in an irrational thought loop that can take them to some dark places. So even if people around them are loving them and they're accompanied by care, it's oftentimes so hard for them to feel it. So as people that care, let's look at what are those warning signs that we want to look at. We talked about risk factors and vulnerable populations, but what are those more imminent things that we may want to look at? Well, we definitely have to repeat a prior suicide attempt because that is something that would put everybody on high alert, or should. But of course, if somebody's currently talking of suicide, planning it, threatening, or making a death wish, or seems somehow to be overly focused on death, that's a big red flag. That and giving away prized possessions, because we know that sometimes people try to make those final arrangements. Sometimes they hint about not being around anymore and they make their goodbyes. And they try to decide, well, I want so-and-so to have this, and this was important to me, and important enough that even if I'm not around, I want it to go to this person or that person. So sometimes it can be very subtle, but we do tend to see these signs sometimes up to a year prior to a death. And we mentioned the signs of depression. Of course, hopelessness is a huge one. And that withdrawal I mentioned before about human beings and how important our social connections are with each other when it comes to our emotional well-being. And of course, another warning sign is rage. And sometimes that's that child that has serious anger issues because they feel the world has wronged them. And sometimes they have reason to feel that way. And sometimes it's perception. But what we do know is we want to look at these things as red flags. And I don't try to make anybody a crisis intervention specialist, but I do know that if we just see some of these things, and if it tells us to be concerned, if something inside of us goes, yeah, that's a little odd, or yeah, that kind of worries me, does it mean they're suicidal or not? My thing is, doesn't matter. No matter what, we want to extend that care. No matter what, we want to show that support, because in my experience, showing extra support to individuals, connecting them to resources that can help them get help, whether it's just a tough time or a very serious diagnosis, I've always seen that that's been able to make a huge difference. And I know for myself in my life, it's made a big difference, that and as well as with other clients I've worked with. On the bottom, I put what sometimes we solely attribute a suicide to. So-and-so made them do it. This is the reason why that happened. This is what we call triggering events. Sometimes there's a loss, a victimization, some type of a disappointment, maybe a rejection, a social rejection. Maybe there was a death or some type of a crisis. Maybe this individual got in trouble. Maybe there was some type of a breakup. And as you may recall, we talked about with youth that tunnel vision that oftentimes accompanies these this vulnerable age group. And, you know, it does feel like the end of the world sometimes when these things happen. And of course, if they're within a vulnerable population and they're already going through a tough time, sometimes this can be that triggering factor that puts them over the edge. And especially if we're looking at a youth that might be more impulsive, sadly, if they've already been exploring the idea of taking their life, it can sometimes push them forward and over the edge towards doing that. So we want to make sure, as we look at all of these things that we want to look out for, we don't want to just look at what we want to prevent. We want to look at what we want to promote and what are those protective factors. And the World Health Organization narrowed it down to 5 really big important ones that they see create the difference in the trajectory that youth are heading on when it comes to their vulnerability. So we want to pray that every kid, and of course, this is in a perfect world, we want them to have that family cohesion and stability. We want them to have great coping and problem-solving skills. And of course, you know, as educators and as individuals with all these different relationships, we want to help encourage that coping and problem-solving skills in the most healthy way possible, as well as those individuals' self-worth, We want to look at their impulse control. You've heard me mention that before. Youth tend to sometimes be more impulsive than adults. We want to encourage those positive connections to school, and those opportunities for extracurricular participation. And they also looked at academic success can be a protective factor as well, because they're engaged with their school. And basically what it also shows me is it's not about that kid who reaches straight A's, but to me, if they're able to succeed academically, that means they're showing up at school with an ability to function. And we know individuals who are experiencing severe depression usually aren't able to function at that level. And then Albert Einstein has another quote that I enjoy. When it comes to that pressure, and it comes to, we have to be so quantitative with our kids when it comes to different school-based activities. And we can't miss the qualitative component of it, because some of our kids are just amazing. And so I love his quote, Albert Einstein's quote, that says, "Everybody is a genius. But if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid." So I think to myself, as I look back at my clients, and I think about what messages some of our students have received about their abilities and their gifts. And I always just encourage adults to make sure that we look for them. Every kid has these beautiful gifts, these unique things that they get to offer our world that are amazing and that no one can duplicate or replicate. No one will ever be just like they are. So I always tell people, catch kids being amazing. We've had some research from Harvard, and this study has been replicated, and we've seen it time and time again. When they put recorders in different classrooms and home environments and school environments to kind of monitor the communication styles between adults and youth and children. And what it tended to see, and of course out of all good intentions by the adults trying to guide and protect and help coach our children along, what it found was that oftentimes that communication from adults to children that was verbal was instructive, punitive, redirective. Hey, don't do that. Oh, go here. Did you do your homework? Okay, don't run. Walk down the hall. Class, you need to do this. You need to do that. Did you do this? What time is this over with? Why did you track mud into the house? Whatever it might be. And sometimes, with all good intentions, we're inadvertently doing what we should know better to do. And again, it's well-intentioned, but what we should know better to do is to really refer back to that behavioralism 101 and really put our attention towards those amazing things our kids do, because behavioralism 101 would tell us whatever you give attention towards is what the type of behavior you're going to see increase, because attention within itself we know is reinforcing. So anything you put attention towards is going to reinforce it. What child, what adult even wants to feel that they're invisible? We all want to feel that we matter and that we're seen. So as adults, I just urge people to really be cognizant of what we show children that we see them for, and what we celebrate. So in general, there's so many important protective factors. We want to encourage them when they're engaging in help-seeking behaviors. We so want them to feel what is so important for human beings as social animals, which is that sense of belonging and connection, whether it's with friends or even with pets. I've had clients who stayed alive because they didn't believe that anyone could take better care of their dog than they would. We have to do our best, especially with those who work with minorities or inner city populations, to ensure their emotional and their physical safety. We want to encourage things that enhance their self-esteem, their healthy coping and problem-solving skills, those positive behaviors and decision-making. And then last but not least, and I really can't stress this enough, and I have to credit Dr. Donald Meichenbaum, who did a lot of research on resiliency, and he's one of the founders of cognitive behavioral psychology. And he actually, tried to think of okay, so, you have these kids, right? Under the best of circumstances, they seem to fail. They seem to not thrive. And then you've got kids who have it as bad as it can get, and they seem to do pretty well. They seem to thrive despite all their risks, despite that they're in a vulnerable population. And what he saw made the difference was that term which we use of resiliency, you know, the ability to adapt to change and to challenges. And, you know, so he did some research and he pondered, well, how do we figure out how to bolster resiliency in kids? And that's great. We'll have the formula, the secret, and we're just going to inoculate all of our youth with resiliency once we figure out how to make that happen. And the one variable that they found time and time again was really this one thing. And it was rather poignant. It said that it was about contact with a caring adult. And by that, I mean that what helped children to be resilient and to beat every odd, whether they had it great or not, was that they had contact with a caring adult. And it need not be familiar. It need not be a family member. It need not be somebody who had been around for their whole life or who would continue to be, but it could be a staff member that was just assigned to them for the year. But the most important thing for that adult was that they had to be consistent in that child's life, whether it was first period gym class or whatever it might be. They had to be consistent in that child's life. That child knew that they could count on them. And somehow that child knew that that adult was invested and cared about them, and that that adult was invested in that child's future. And that was one of the biggest things that helped to determine that child's ability to be resilient. So I put at the bottom of this slide that you play a special role in children's lives. I can only imagine that there are countless of lives of children that you have been that caring adult for, that you have made all the difference for. So I just so appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this webinar and hopefully to continue to support you all in this amazing role that you play in your children's lives. When it comes to prevention, so 4 big things to summarize. We want to definitely increase our children's connections to adults. We want to enhance those protective factors. We even want to train peer leaders from diverse groups. So we want to make sure that kids have different people that they might not be able to identify with, because again, as I mentioned before, children tend to talk to their peers before they talk to adults. So I think there's a great deal of importance that comes from really educating kids and galvanizing them and empowering them to be leaders and to making a difference, so that they can do, you know, as my 4th bullet says, so that they can break that code of silence, so we can get that dialogue going and we can really speak up about it. This last one I've got to add, we know the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. So let's try some new things. Let's experiment together to see how we can best support our students and our youth around us. And as I began this webinar, I'm also going to end it by saying, don't forget your own mental health. You cannot give that which you can't have. You all are day-to-day heroes in the lives of our children. And I want to make sure that you all stay strong emotionally, mentally, physically, spiritually, every which way, so you can continue to make that life-changing and life-saving difference that you have. A few quick resources for you all. National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. We've got the American Association of Suicidology, American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, and the Suicide Prevention Resource Center. These are all great resources if you'd like to obtain more information on this. And I do believe, as per another quote, that at times our own light goes out and it's rekindled by the spark of another person. Each one of us has cause to think deep gratitude for those who have lighted the flame within us. I say that with deep respect to my peers and colleagues who are listening in on this webinar. At times you've been that for me. I hope to support you all in doing that for so many other people. So I thank you so much for all of your tireless work every day in, day out. Here's my email address. It's grace@ganleyfoundation.org. That's Grace, Grace, at GanleyFoundation.org. And I encourage you all, beyond this webinar, to really use me as a resource. That's what we're here for. Our services are fully funded, so we come at no cost to your school or organization, whether it's arranging a webinar, FaceTiming me into your school, giving me a phone call for my thoughts or suggestions for maybe any particular challenge you might be going through. Or if you're local to South Florida, I'd be more than happy to come in person and visit your school. I'm always happy to provide presentations like this, not only for students, but for staff, for parents, for administration, and for community members. That's really what the Ganley Foundation is here for. And I look at myself and I'm just humbled to be in a role where I get to support so many amazing individuals like you. And that's what we're here for. So I thank you so much for your time. If you have any questions or you want to use our resources, by all means, reach out to me, and keep doing the great work that you're doing. Thank you so much, and goodbye.
Thank you, Grace. Thank you so much for that very, very informative and great webinar. And if anybody does have any further questions, please reach out to Grace. She, would be very much willing to answer any of your questions and give more resources and talk to you. If you have anything specific that you want to ask, definitely go ahead and contact her. Thank you so much for watching the webinar. Thank you, Grace, for your services and for everything that you do for us to help us school counselors and mental health professionals in our field. And thank you so much for doing the webinar for us.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Maritza. Thank you for being a part of it and making it happen.
Thank you.